So, hi again. Thank you for joining our book launch and symposium tonight on rethinking global security and alternatives to war. My name is Tony Jenkins. I know a few of you in the room. I'm a professor here at Georgetown in the Justice and Peace Studies program, and I'm also the education director of World Beyond War, and I wear a few other hats as well. So this evening has multiple purposes for us. First, we're here to celebrate kind of a very overdue formal launch of this book, the 2018-19 edition of A Global Security System and Alternative to War, which is a publication of World Beyond War, and I'll talk about this in just a minute. Second, we are here to open a bigger dialogue on perspectives on the possibilities of establishing a more authentic global security system. One that is an alternative to the present war system, which we'll talk a little bit about. And we've invited two special guests to help us with that in particular. We have, to initiate that dialogue, we've invited tonight Madison Schramm, down here. Madison, say hello. She is the 2018-19 Hillary Rodham Clinton Research Fellow here at Georgetown's Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. And we also have, at the far end of the table, David Swanson, author, activist, and director of World Beyond War, a global movement to end all wars. And then the third reason that we're here tonight, I think, is the most important. This evening we have an opportunity to spotlight some of what I think are some very future visionary thinkers that I believe are going to become the leaders and the agents of change who are going to be helping make these alternative visions a reality. So three of our panelists tonight, here at the center of the table, are seniors in the Justice and Peace Studies program here at Georgetown. We have Samantha Mata, Kendall Sil-Wonek, and Annalisa Sanders. And they also happen to be students in the course here at Georgetown on rethinking global security, which I'm currently teaching. And so they're going to be highlighting for us tonight some of the challenges that they've observed and some of the possibilities that they believe in for establishing a true and authentic global security system in which peace is pursued by peaceful means. I've been pretty deeply inspired by Samantha, Kendall, and Annalisa for the past 13 weeks. They've challenged my thinking, and certainly they've pushed and changed my perspective on more than one thing. And I'm kind of hopeful that they'll do that for you tonight as well. And while they're technically still my students, I remind myself that in a couple of weeks we're finishing up. I have to give them grades. I think it's time that we embrace them more as colleagues and as co-learners. These are the people who are inheriting the future of this work, and they are brilliant, and we need to support them and give them the trust that they deserve. So I hope that motivates you for your talks this evening. So before we get to our panel, I want to talk a little bit about the book, because this is the book launch portion of the evening. And this is, again, A Global Security System and Alternative to War, or as we coarsely call it, AGSS for short. And with the help of many hands from World Beyond War, I finished updating this edition to the book just a few weeks prior to the beginning of the semester. And in fact, you've all had the preview edition of the book. You've seen it in a couple different forms. So this book has served as an inspiration and kind of the main outline for the course that we've been taking together. And we've also been complementing it by a lot of different diverse sort of historical perspectives and alternative approaches to security. In essence, what this book is a blueprint from World Beyond War and a plan of action for ending all wars. And I'll try to just kind of identify really quickly a few of the key elements of that blueprint. This is something that is rather ambitious, but it's the backbone of a lot of World Beyond War's work. We update this book annually to reflect new research, new thinking, respond to new and emerging threats to global security, and explore and assess new alternatives that are emerging that we maybe haven't thought of or considered before. Now, this book begins by outlining the need for an alternative system, while at the same time also providing a really important critique of the present paradigm of militarized nation-state security. And we're going to talk a lot about that tonight, especially in your presentations. But we might also call this by its more accurately descriptive name, the war system. And that's going to come up a few times as well. So maybe some of the arguments in this book may seem tired and old to those amongst us who have been studying war for far too long. But it remains really kind of very essential for us to be able to understand the social, cultural, political, and economic underpinnings of the military, industrial, corporate, academic complex that we're all a part of. So the war system for us rests in part on a set of deeply interlocked beliefs and values that have been around for so long that their veracity and utility have gone mostly unquestioned, although we know them to be demonstrably false. So an inspiration for this book for me comes from Margaret Mead. And those in peace studies here at Georgetown will know this idea pretty well. She observed that warfare is not something that's in our genes, that in fact is a human invention. And not only is there no scientific evidence of any kind of genetic predisposition to war, there is also no viable anthropological evidence to suggest that our hunter-gathering ancestors ever engaged in war-making activities. And some of that is outlined in the book. The fact is, ultimately, that we humans have lived without war for most of our existence. It's a relatively recent human invention. So one of the things that this book looks at is if we accept this idea that war is a human invention, what are we to do about it, right? So Mead also observed that social inventions have faded away. But for this to happen, two conditions need to be met. First and foremost, we have to recognize the defects of the old system. And regarding that, we're pretty well aware of the defects of war. We don't have to find and engage in much research to understand there's very little upside. But the second condition is the most important for us here, is we must make a new invention to replace the old. And that is what this book is all about. With what do we replace the war system? What alternatives might currently exist that are more preferred to the present one that we're in? Which ideas and alternatives and different approaches still need to be imagined, and we maybe haven't figured them all out. Once we have a clear vision of a system to replace the war system, then how do we go about facilitating that transition from the old to the new? What must we know? What skills do we have to develop to be able to do it? That's some of the things this book seeks to address. Who should be part of that transition? What's each of our roles in this room at this table? These are some of the questions we try to answer. We also draw from Gene Sharp, amongst others, the revered and recently departed scholar of nonviolence, who argued that the war system does serve a function, that of security. We could describe it as that. But the problem, of course, is that the war system has completely failed at this. National security, collective security, or militarized security, these are all frameworks for pursuing peace through violence and peace through strength. These approaches, in fact, we would argue, make us much less secure. They require us, amongst other things, live under a constant threat of violence. They shift our economies and our priorities away from human and ecological needs into the war system. So this book invites us and really begins to ask us to think fundamentally different about what makes us secure. We draw heavily from two frameworks that are really important to us: human security and common security as our preferred alternatives. Human security is a much more people-centered vision of security. It's one that emphasizes physical safety, economic, social well-being, the assurance of human needs being met, respect for the dignity and worth of human beings as part of what is needed for having security. It is a feminist vision of everyday security. Common security, complementing that, acknowledges that no one nation can be safe unless all nations are safe. Right? No one is safe unless all are safe. These conditions can't be met underneath our present system. Nonviolence is the other sort of main cornerstone of our system. We draw heavily from, amongst others, the research of Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan, who demonstrated statistically that nonviolence is significantly more effective, almost twice as much as effective as other forms of armed resistance, for example. And in short, we explore and make arguments that nonviolence simply works better and is more sustainable than war. Nonviolence informs all the strategies throughout our blueprint. But now I want to get to the good stuff. And maybe this illustration up here on the screen is a little bit scrunched for you to really see it. But this book proposes the achievement of an alternative paradigm, one that's rooted in human security, common security, and nonviolence, that it can be achieved by pursuing three broad strategies. And you can kind of see them up here in the image. Through demilitarizing security, through managing conflicts without violence, and through the creation of a culture of peace. Now, demilitarizing security is obviously essential for moving us away from our dependence on military intervention. When we propose and assess several transitionary strategies, we identify the need for shifting to a non-provocative defense posture, phasing out foreign military bases, dismantling military alliances such as NATO, ending invasions and occupations, and providing the rationales for these in the book. AGSS also calls for general and complete disarmament, and this isn't something that we hear talked about very much anywhere, certainly not in the UN anymore. What we argue essentially is as long as a weaponized system of security remains, weapons will be accumulated and weapons will be used. We know this to be true. So to get to disarmament, we acknowledge the deep entrenchment of the military-industrial complex. So we also put forward strategies for transitioning to a peace economy through economic conversion, through creating a more stable, just, and environmentally sustainable global economy. We also highlight the importance of increasing the role of women in peace and security decision-making, such as argued for and called for by Security Council Resolution 1325. Our second set of strategies for managing conflict without violence, these are the tools and institutions that we designate as necessary for assuring security nonviolently. Here we seek out in our strategies a balance between reforming existing institutions and establishing new ones. We acknowledge, obviously, the weakness that's inherent in the UN system, especially its emphasis on collective security, and the challenges, obviously, of overcoming national self-interest. And while these tremendous obstacles might essentially be deal breakers, the UN is currently our main form of global governance, and a few aspects of it do work particularly well. Thus, our strategy carefully considers how we might reform, particularly, and strengthen some of the different security functions of the UN, peace-building, peacekeeping efforts. We also explore the relevance of strengthening international law. How might we reform things like the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, as well as explore possibilities for how we can strengthen and more effectively enforce existing treaties and create new treaties. We also firmly acknowledge the limited functioning of a system that's comprised of nation states. And we identify, which I think our speakers will tonight, a number of different strategies for greater participation of civil society in the functioning of our security system. And in this light, we also carefully consider the potential of Gene Starp's vision of civilian-based defense. And we also propose a few alternative visions of global governance to shake things up and invite the readers of our book to consider what are those kind of underlying essential principles and functions that should guide a peaceful world order. And the last cornerstone or on this map, a circle of our roadmap, is the need to establish a culture of peace. I don't know how many people are familiar with this, but the UN Declaration and Program of Action on a Culture of Peace. Article 2 of that declaration speaks of progress in the full development of a culture of peace comes through the values, attitudes, modes of behavior, and ways of life that are conducive to the promotion of peace amongst individuals, groups, and nations. So this cultural change dimension is very important. So we look at and exploring this, amongst other things, formal and non-formal peace education and peace study strategies, and the leveraging of peace research as essential tools for changing attitudes incapacitating citizens with the essential skills of peacemaking and peace building. And we also explore and promote the idea of educational efforts to support global citizenship as an essential foundation of building and deepening interconnection and interdependence amongst and between people on a shared planet. So I want to wrap up by coming back to Margaret Mead and then turn it over to our panel. One of the other things that Margaret Mead talked about is a kind of a third condition that must be met for these old inventions to fade away. And this is probably the most difficult one. She said that we need to essentially have the belief that a social invention is even possible, right? Getting past the kind of pessimism that the war system festers within us is not really an easy task. Futurists are really keen to point out, for example, that it's terribly difficult to imagine and construct preferred realities when our visions of the future are guided by present probabilities. So there's a projected path that we're on based upon the present mess that we're in. We can't see the global security system as an alternative to the war system. So each of our panelists tonight has been invited to speak for 10 minutes, give or take. After we've heard from each of our panelists, we're going to open up the floor here in the room and online for those watching via Facebook Live on WorldBeyondWar's page to join us into some dialogue and Q&A. So we're going to start our panel tonight with the students, with Samantha, Kendall, and Annalisa. They're each going to be sharing some analysis and probing some alternative possibilities to challenge some of the underlying issues of security that's particularly tied, as I mentioned earlier, to the nation-state model. So this is something that's been inspiring to them throughout the course of our studies together. Samantha's going to get us started by exploring the problem at a global level. Kendall's going to give us kind of a nice bridge, I believe, between the global and the local. And Annalisa is going to kind of round us off by exploring some of the more community, localized, and kind of civilian level strategies that can propose and proposals for security. And then after we hear from each of them, I'm going to turn it over first to Madison and then David. And they've also been invited to share from their own unique experiences. I haven't given them any specific prompts and perspectives on an alternative system. And I also hope that they'll have the opportunity to respond to the great work that you've all done. And then we'll open it up for you. Okay? Sound good? So are you ready? Mm-hmm. All right. I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, my name is Sam. I am a senior in the Justice and Peace Studies program here, concentrating on gender justice and minoring in economics and theater. I'm originally from the DC area, so I grew up really surrounded by the federal government, but my prior class experience in the JUPS program has been largely community-oriented, so this has been a great first experience tackling a global security topic. So what I'll present on today is I'll speak first about sort of the ideal global governance system that we've discussed in our classes, and then address some primary and actionable issues within the current system, mostly in the form of the United Nations, that result from the current nation-state system. So to speak first about an ideal future global governance system, some of the things that we've discussed in this class have been that an ideal system is representative of all peoples, not all nations, knowing that nations don't necessarily represent all of the people that live in them. An ideal system is coordinated between the global and local level, enforces laws that are created for a global system rather than national laws altered to be international. An ideal system focuses on human security, so again, this idea that you provide for people. It protects the environment and is centered on preventing war and violence. So one of the main ways to move towards this ideal system is to move away from a nation-state system. So creating some sort of global body that reflects communities besides nations. So one way to work towards this is by localizing representatives, and I can give here the example of Rwanda. That in Rwanda, local neighborhoods actually have representatives that sort of move up the chain to the nation level, which helps address issues before they ever become affecting larger communities. So Rwanda is a nation with about 12 million people in it. The US population is 325 million, so think of all the communities that don't have their voices heard here. And so it's important to hear from those that are not represented in national institutions but still reside in those areas, because people who live in the communities are going to know better about what they need than outsiders. And it's also important to address discrimination that prevents people from participating in these current political systems. So giving others the opportunity to participate in the current systems, but then also allowing our current systems to recognize community-led initiatives as part of the official political system. Increasing representation within a global governance system can also come through removing a patriarchal default and including more women in discussions, which would help solve problems for 50% of the population before they even occur by allowing them to be part of the negotiations. And this would also help address gender-specific crimes and issues. So issues that disproportionately affect women in conflict zones. Women need to be part of making those solutions because they're the ones that will be able to come up with solutions that really affect the discrimination or violence that they may have faced firsthand. And again, this goes with the idea of creating a system of human security, creating security that helps the real people that live in this world rather than constructed nations or institutions. And also different backgrounds bring different perspectives. So people of different ages, ethnicities, language speakers, genders experience the world differently through their intersectional identity. So global solutions really need to come at the intersection of all of those identities when they've had the chance to be represented. In addition, empowering people from below is important. So allowing perhaps NGOs greater access to the United Nations and its representatives. NGOs do great on the ground work that, if brought to the attention of representatives, could make a positive difference in these systems. And this is a great example of coordinating between the global and local level without even having to make major changes to the current system. So we often see great work in grassroots movements in the US. For example, Black Lives Matter brings the experience of people of color to the forefront of politics without necessarily being given officially sanctioned political capital. Or organizations like Emily's List, which supports Democratic women running for office, had 24 candidates get elected this midterm cycle through their organization. So allowing organizations like this that work directly with the people to be a part of this global system is important. Second, I think one actionable issue is helping craft international law from a global perspective rather than just modifying nation-state laws. So to begin, it's important to get rid of Eurocentric legal systems. Western dominance means that these perspectives control global laws. And so it's important to shift the vocabulary to one that really works for a global system, not forces people to comply to a Western system. And we should look at local laws for these ideas of construction, but not copying them, because local laws are created to solve local problems. And especially when you're working with local laws that are Western, it may negatively affect places that wouldn't otherwise operate according to that system. So again, having a representative mix of people with equal power in the discussion is very important. Also transitioning to a restorative justice model, so models of justice that focus on rehabilitation and restoring trust between perpetrators and victims. So this kind of works off the idea that bad actions are usually manifestations of unmet need. So justice should both resolve to meet this need and reconcile issues between perpetrators and victims, which again would focus on the human part of human security. And restorative justice models have widely shown that at the end, there are stronger community relationships and more trust between parties to help prevent further transgressions. Next, enforcing these laws is important. So actually putting resources towards enforcing a global legal system and prioritizing enforcement and conflict prevention financially and economically, perhaps through the use of civilian-based methods, so that justice actually occurs in practice. And then lastly, education. Educating people on their rights as global citizens so that they can recognize when they're able to take legal action within a global system and providing them resources to exercise this action. So one great example of this that recently came and spoke at Georgetown is the Fair Food Program, which is a farm workers' rights organization that does workplace monitoring for farm workers to ensure that they're receiving fair wages and not experiencing discrimination or harassment. And they operate on a four-pronged approach. First, they educate workers on their rights in their native language. Then they have a confidential phone line available in these different languages for workers to report issues. Third, they do third-party unscheduled monitoring and checks, often and anytime a complaint is received. And then fourth, they use economic pressure to require farm owners to comply with these standards by partnering with the clients that buy from these farms. So clients sign on to pull out of purchasing from these farms if the farm is not complying with these standards. So in terms of transferring that to a global context, you can think about the different forms of education, providing resources to report, constant unbiased monitoring, and then smart sanctions that harm only top-tier perpetrators rather than the common worker. So while efforts should continue to move towards an ideal system, this is done through taking individual steps. So moving away from nation-state model as the only model that can exist in a global governance system, and reconfiguring international law are two things that could occur now. So as we sort of move forward through the other speakers, I invite you to think about how we can move from these ideal systems that we discuss to applicable change. And I'll invite Kendall up here.
I'm Kendall. I am also a senior in the JEPS program, and also a little bit obsessed with this idea of breaking down the nation-state system. And I think that partly comes from my background as a Gov major as well. I was originally a Gov major before I was introduced to JEPS, and I was attracted to this Justice and Peace program because the idea that peace is possible and that there are these alternatives was very attractive to me when I'm also sitting in international security classes where we're learning about the current nation-state system and how strong that is. So I am excited to talk about ways in which the civil society can break down the nation-state system, and then possibilities of doing so tomorrow and right now as individuals ourselves. I want to start with a brief story, and some of you may be familiar, but Professor Jenkins introduced me to a man named Gary Davis, or to his story. He was a World War II veteran and a former Broadway actor, and in 1948 he went to Paris, and he was 4 years older than the three of us when he declared himself a global citizen and renounced his U.S. citizenship and allegiance, and became the first citizen of the world. After this, he asked the UN to become the global government and to abolish the nation-state system, and received support from many individuals who saw this nation-state system as having created 2 world wars and as having looming nuclear threats present. There are currently 750,000 people who declare themselves world citizens because of Mr. Davis. So I think this is an interesting story because Davis had this idea of breaking down the nation-state system through global institutions and bridging the local and the individual level to this much larger United Nations institution. So I want to work on that idea a little bit. His World Government for World Citizens is still very active today and still releases global citizen passports and identity cards. And I want to use this framework of global citizenship to talk about breaking down the nation-state system. So I'm going to do this in 4 steps. I'll talk a little bit about what this nation-state system, or what it should transition into. Then I want to introduce a couple ongoing projects to create this transition. I want to talk about a few dilemmas, which Sam mentioned, and invite you to think about those as well so we can get into discussing maybe how to avoid them in this transition. And then I want to close with a couple actions that are happening right now that are working in the same way of bypassing national institutions and working on the global level to break down the nation-state. So as we've discussed, the security system is currently a nation-state system, but should be moving towards a common security or a human security model, where no one is safe until all are safe. And global citizenship and cosmopolitanism, these ideas encourage this because all of a sudden you don't see people on the other side of the world as other. You see them as fellow humans and you respect their dignity in this framework. And I think that new story and that transition towards an identity as one global citizen and connected to the rest is important. As we talk about globalization now, a lot of times it's globalization because of business connections and because of the capitalist markets we've created, and globalization because of media outlets which engage in these markets. And a lot of times these are very harmful to many people around the world. So I think it's important to transition from globalization as markets towards globalization as human identity and as neighbors and friends, and respecting the dignity of other people, so that a global government is possible and sounds very feasible to all people. In this new global government, it's important to think about demilitarizing, not just disarmament. We've talked a lot about that concept of not just getting rid of weapons, but also taking out the military aspects of culture, which I think is very important and also something that civil society can engage in before the national government gets there. So I want to introduce you to two current projects to foster this idea of cosmopolitanism and to bridge civil society to international institutions and global government by bypassing the nation states. So UNESCO currently has an education program, the Global Citizenship Education, which works to equip learners of all ages. They believe that learning is a lifelong process, which is one of the core values of peace education we talked about. And they work to equip learners with the skills and knowledge to work towards social justice and to work towards human rights and protecting rights, and to be responsible global citizens. And in this advocacy work, they teach individuals and community groups their value and their access points to global institutions, which will allow them to create change and to utilize global resources without depending on the nation state and the current system to create change. So I think this education is very important because it fosters this idea of a global citizenship. And it calls on civil society to be responsible even when the national government is not protecting human security and is not meeting human needs. Another bit of work that's being done currently is we've talked about UN reform and how NGOs, non-government organizations, and community organizations should have a larger voice in UN decision-making and policy drafting, especially educating citizens that they have access to the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice and can report themselves. They also have access to the UN through NGOs. It's important for people to know this, and I don't know that a lot of civil society is called upon to act in these ways. A lot of times decision makers in drafting these treaties and these international norms are the people who are working in government, the people who are nominated by our president. And I think that that's problematic, and civil society can engage. There are current outlets to do so. A few dilemmas that I see in the system, and I'm sure that there are many more, so please bring them up in the discussion at the end. But as Sam mentioned, it's possible when you're creating a global government to really lose local voice. And it's also possible that through these education systems, those with access to this education are going to be those with the most power and the most privilege. So I think that it's very important in transitioning from the local to the global, and in building these pipelines for civil society to engage in global government, that we maintain that local voice and empower the minority voices that should be involved in these decision makings. That conflict should be localized, and people who are building treaties and working in peacekeeping to address conflict should be those involved. And keeping that local voice, I think, should help solve this dilemma, but please help me brainstorm on that. Also, this idea that international law is very Western dominated, as Sam mentioned, and it's written based on Western laws, is problematic. And in drafting any kind of international law, we have to respect local laws. So I think that building structures to make sure that is held to accountability, and that people are making sure that they're not overstepping and creating policy that is going to hurt local actors is very important. A couple initiatives right now that are pretty easy for us to get involved in bypassing the nation state, especially the United States. Ray Atchison introduced us to one. She is working in the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. And she proposed indirectly attacking our nuclear weapon system by asking citizens to divest from the companies and the organizations which are funding nuclear weapon research and production. So that's something that's pretty easy to do. You know you can tell where your money in your bank is being invested. You know which companies you're buying from. And being cognizant of these things is one easy step that all of us can take tomorrow to deny the government the power to make decisions for us and to work towards this global vision of peace. Another is alternate recruiting. So there are recruiting organizations that work to recruit for peace forces instead of military forces and try to compete in that way. We can also offer more support for Treaties for Peace and empower local organizations to get involved in drafting these treaties. I think that the role of public conscience is really important. And in signing these treaties, the Western NGOs, the big humanitarian organizations that are involved, should not be the only voices. And of course, the government shouldn't be making these decisions. It should be civil society and local organizations. So I think that there are ways for us as civilians and as community organizers to bypass the nation state and to take power and delegitimize the nation state in these ways and work towards this global governance we've talked about. So I think Annalisa is going to talk a lot more about the individual responsibility for this.
Everyone, my name is Annalisa, and I am also a senior with majoring in Justice and Peace Studies. This class has been very eye-opening for me, and I think that the peace security system, as we've studied it and as the examples that we've learned about this past semester, offer a great deal of hope when thinking about the current state of the world as it is today and where we want it to go in the future. Even looking at how full this room is tonight, I find a lot of hope in that. So thus far, we've discussed big themes of global citizenship and reform to the present security system, or as Professor Jenkins called it, the war system. But when we talk about wanting to change the present system, I think that it seems to many like a daunting and even impossible task. I know that at times, as we've explored these different concepts, it has seemed that way to me. And I believe that in order to truly change our present system, we must simultaneously push for change to our policies at the top, while also informing and swaying people from the bottom. In coordination, we will be able to break down the present system and refocus on the influence that individuals can hold in building a peaceful security system. In this discussion, I'm going to talk about the importance of individual responsibility as well as community strategies which can emerge once we embrace the individual component of a peace system. So the overarching question here is, how do we go about convincing people that this system is both beneficial and doable? I think that in answering those two questions, we'll be able to engage many more people in a peaceful security system and get them on board. So to begin, we need to start with educating and informing people about the damages done by war. Oftentimes, the way that we approach this information, it's viewed as something which is international, abroad, and doesn't touch us close to home. However, there are a couple ways that we can make sure that we look at the war system as something that is personal. The first is looking at the environmental costs of war. Environmental costs of war exist in the entire spectrum of war, from production and manufacturing of weapons to the deployment and use of them on individuals. This has absolutely oftentimes irreversible effects on the land which we share as a common humanity. Additionally, the human cost is just as high, with soldiers and civilians who die in war every single day, as well as the people who are displaced from their homes as they flee from violence, which is a part of the war system. Education also needs to include the fiscal realities of war, and I think that this is where we can really convince people about how war is affecting their daily lives, even if they're not living in a conflict zone. Too much of American spending goes to wars, with the federal military budget inching closer and closer to $1 trillion each year. We should all be concerned because this allocation of funds towards military is taking money out of our communities and out of the resources that individuals need, which leads to a security crisis within our communities, and that would be a human security crisis. So by educating citizens, we can hope to demonstrate just how costly war is, not just to others, but also to themselves. And we can show them that there are changes which they can make. A huge part of this education process is going to be informing people about the human security framework as an option to replace the current militarized security framework. And after this education process is done, I think that we should begin by introducing easy starter solutions for individuals, which provide access into the peace security movement in very simple and doable ways. Examples of this would be divestment, advocacy, political action, general awareness, and community building. Making things approachable and feasible would be the key for getting people involved. And through this process, I believe that there would be an increase in communal bonds which would form as people start to focus not just on themselves and what it is that they're missing in their lives. And as a more secure community is built, they'll be able to engage with each other as fellow people who also have needs. And that's one of the greatest elements of the human security framework, is this strengthening of community bonds. And through this, we can set the groundwork for alternative security systems which can be organized from communities. And these should be, so it would set the groundwork for both demilitarization of the present system as well as the installation of nonviolent peaceful security systems from the ground up. So by creating a peace culture in our communities, we open the space for a shift to non-provocative defense postures, which can replace the present system. This shift won't be easy, and having clear goals will ease the transition and allow individuals to be more engaged advocates for non-provocative defense themselves. These defense postures would include a few key factors, including eliminating weapons and production of weapons, closing down our military bases abroad, and ending invasions and occupations. Through these 3 steps, as well as many others, we can eliminate security needs throughout the world. The process is meant to be slow and should not be considered the only step in creating a peace system. The function is to limit warfare and the extent of the military security system while minimizing the security paradigm. As the US is one of the greatest perpetrators, we have a lot of influence over the international security system as it exists today. In addition to these steps, a position of civilian-based defense can be introduced to replace what we have now as a military security system with a nonviolent security system, which is organized within our communities. Civilian-based defense refers to an organized system of nonviolence, and it has a few key principles, including nonviolence, noncompliance, and resistance. These factors aim to dissuade military action against societies, as well as to deter invasion, and these are the 2 factors which are presented by Gene Sharp, who was an advocate for this policy. Nonviolence is proven to be more effective than armed conflict. But in order for this to happen, communities need to be both on board and educated in how these systems can work. So the importance of individual involvement in the processes of transitioning from militarized security to peace systems cannot be underestimated. Individuals hold the power of the companies and leaders who pull the strings of warfare. By divesting, educating, and advocating for peace, we can build a stronger community and lay the foundation of a peace culture that invests in human security, not a militarized version of it. So in conclusion, I would invite you to ask yourself, what steps would you be willing to take to contribute to a peaceful system, and how feasible do you think these systems are? What will you do to make a difference?
Can you give the 3, this is really wonderful. So Annalisa, Kendall, Samantha, this was fantastic. I'm so happy I don't have to speak after you, because you really outshined me. And that, what greater reward for a teacher than that, right? So could we give them all a round of applause once again? And then let me turn it over to Madison.
Can I stay seated?
You can stay seated there, that's fine.
Great. Yes, I was going to start with, this is just an extraordinarily tough act to follow. All three of you raised incredibly thought-provoking questions, and Professor Jenkins mentioned you are all seniors, so I'm very much looking forward to what you do next. So I'm going to start, first of all, I am Madison Trim. I'm a PhD candidate here at Georgetown in International Relations and a fellow at the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security, a couple streets over. So the institute, the Research Institute investigates the intersection of women in conflict, but I'm going to talk today a little bit about my dissertation research, as well as a few things I'm focusing on with regard to women in foreign policy. So following on the excellent points you all brought up, I'm going to sort of take a deep dive into some of the individual level aspects. So what are the psychological biases? What are the sociological questions that might predispose individuals to support coercive action or war against others? So first I'll start with my dissertation research. So I started with a question, so why is it that democracies tend to find themselves in conflict with personalist regimes? In personalist regimes, the leader makes decisions without consultation from civil society, other economic or political elites, and derives power from manufactured charisma and patronage. And if we think about the great villains that the US has engaged in recently, we tend to think of Saddam Hussein, Osama bin Laden. We tend to think of individuals as opposed to groups, right? And this is sort of intuitive. But I was wondering if this trend was borne out, not just in the US, but among other democracies, and why that would be. And actually I found that since 1945, democracies have been between 2 and 3 times as likely to engage in coercive action with personalist regimes than with other types of autocratic states. So why is this? So I propose sort of a 2-pronged explanation. The first is that there are certain psychological biases that actually make it easier for us to perceive individuals as more threatening than groups. So the first of which could be thought of as the vividness effect, or the fact that we tend to weight information that seems more tangible, more heavily. The second is the attribution, that it's easier to disregard our adversary's bad behavior to their person rather than context. And a third can be the availability heuristic. We tend to weight things more heavily if we're able to come up with examples fairly readily. But if this was the case, if we were just all psychologically predisposed to engage in conflict with particular types of regimes or to perceive these individuals as more threatening, then why is it specific to democracies? And I found that actually these, rather than psychological biases existing sort of independent from our social identity, they are very much constituted by our socialization. And in democracies, particularly the post-World War II narrative, has sort of defined our other as autocratic leaders. And so this interaction of these psychological biases and the socialization to a particular narrative predisposes democracies to engage in conflict with leaders that are perceived as personalist, whether or not the institutional structure corresponds. So again, this brings me sort of to my first question. So if some of these psychological biases and social narratives that several of you mentioned are sort of that deeply embedded, how do we disrupt those? How through our everyday practice, through discourse, through education, can we challenge things that are potentially embedded within us, either psychologically or that we learn through our socialization? So my second sort of stream of research focuses on women in foreign policy. So I'm currently working on a paper called Peacemakers or Iron Ladies. We think of female heads of government as a relatively new phenomena. And interestingly, they're often referred to as peacemakers. But just as often, they're referred to as Iron Ladies. We think of it as specific to Margaret Thatcher, but actually most female heads of government have at one time or another sort of donned the moniker of Iron Lady. And what we found is that in particularly constrained systems or parliamentary democracies where the head of government is more vulnerable, female heads of government are actually more likely to initiate coercive action than their male counterparts, which seems kind of surprising. That's not what we would expect. And what we find is that these findings go away when you're in positions or you're in systems where the head of government has more freedom of movement, is less vulnerable. So what we argue is that there's actually a performance of gender. Female heads of government are actually compelled to perform gender against type, to signal to the men that they're more masculine, that they're going to be tough on security. And this pressure actually increases the likelihood that they're going to engage in coercive action. And so similarly, we find that these results wash away if we increase the level of women's political empowerment. So there seems to also be a threshold effect. So you get more women in the room, and women don't feel compelled. And this has sociological implications for all types of groups, right? When you're in the minority, when you're the other, what sort of performative tasks do you have to engage in to convince your colleagues that you're strong on defense? So we're currently engaging in that. Also at the Institute, I am looking at female heads of government and women in parliament to see how it is that they're best able to advocate for women. So we know that having women in office, women in different positions of power, is highly correlated with different social indicators, particularly those for women. But we also know that women face this really are in this precarious position of trying to advocate for women and for the general public. And so are there particular sectors they might be more successful in? So this sort of brings me to several follow-ups, and I apologize, I'm going to leave you with more questions than answers. So again, the first is, how do we disrupt these social narratives? How do we disrupt these ideas that, as women in a group of men, we have to signal that we're going to be tough on security? How do we disrupt these psychological biases that are deeply constituted by our social identity that make us perceive certain groups as anathema to ourselves? And Kendall brought up this interesting idea of a global government. This got me thinking, and I had been talking previously about perpetual peace and the sort of long warned against idea of global leviathan. So how do we sort of make sure, thinking of the current Security Council or other international organizations and bodies, how do we make sure that you don't have a certain body is disproportionately represented? And how do you make sure that it is truly a democratic system and not a global leviathan? So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Is it better to stay here or to go over there?
Wherever you're most comfortable. How is it for everyone here? Is it better there or over here? It's okay? All right.
Okay, I'll stay here. You tell me when I've talked too long. First of all, thank you. I was going to say Tony's. Thank you, Professor Jenkins, for putting this together. I think we should thank all kinds of people who are thanked in the front of the book, but Kent Schiffert, Patrick Hiller, a number of people really helped put this book together, which really does more than I think any individual on our own could have come up with. I think Tony has done a great deal to advance this book and to create a study guide and an upcoming online course and all kinds of extra information that you can find on WorldBeyondWar.org. These presentations were wonderful. I hope that all of you continue to work in this field. I spoke at a high school today where students were studying peace, and they were bright, they were engaged, but there is a definite step up when I got here, and I went from how dare you challenge the eternal goodness of this great nation to let's think about eliminating nations. So that was that was a great progress. Here's my card, by the way, for a member of the human race, from the organization started by Gary Davis. So I also hope that all of you and all of you in the room and all of you watching will work with us this coming April 4th in this town on a day that ought to mark Martin Luther King Jr.'s greatest speech against war and violence and his assassination, but on which NATO proposes to desecrate the day with a celebration of itself. And so we are organizing and thinking about a creative unwelcoming of NATO to Washington, D.C., and want you all to help us with that. Go to notonato.org and get involved. I do wish that someone from the so-called securities studies department had been willing to come here, and I think maybe the next event, if you can't get a professor to come and defend the idea that endangering this country and making us less secure has something to do with creating security, get some of the students, because I think these students that we've just heard from could engage in a quite interesting, friendly, respectful debate with some students that disagreed. And I think those are the kind of events that really get more people in the room and thinking. we had people tell us don't put security in the title of our book because it's been taken over by the meaning of militarism. Security means bombing people and making your country resented and less liked by the world, which of course is the opposite of security. So I'm glad that that Professor Jenkins argued for keeping that word in there. We've been putting up big billboards around the world with anti-war messages, and we had someone recently call me up and want to give us a bunch of money to put up billboards near U.S. military bases encouraging people not to join the military. And we sort of came up with ideas, phrases, slogans to put on the billboard, and somebody said, well, let's include on there are better ways to create security and safety than war. And somebody else, in fact, the guy donating the money, said, no, we can't put that on there because that opens up this big unanswered question, this mystery of what are those other ways? Well, it's not an unanswered question. It's a question very convincingly answered by a great volume of scholarship that is summarized in this book, and it's everything that Tony talked about. And I didn't come up with the idea for this book, and it's not really what would have occurred to me, because when somebody asks me what should we do instead of bombing Yemen, my initial response is stop bombing Yemen. You don't ask me what should I do instead of slavery, or what should I do instead of rape, or what should I do instead of a big government program of child abuse. You stop it, right? Well, I think there is a second answer that's a little less, less quick, which is you deal with whatever the propaganda around the evil individual has been that's gotten you into the war. You prosecute the crime as a crime in court, or you search for the non-existent weapons, or you deal with the fictionally threatened massacre. You deal with the issue at hand with sensible, rational ways, more likely to succeed and resolve it. But I think there's a third, more serious answer, which this book really gets at, which is you change the system. You replace war with actual aid, not so-called military aid, at a fraction of the cost, with cooperation, with the rule of law, with respect for international law, which international law may have a Western bias, but it also has an outlier that more than almost any other nation on earth is not a member of most significant human rights treaties in the world, and is not just keeping itself out of international bodies like the International Criminal Court, but is threatening crimes against anyone who supports those bodies. And that is this rogue nation that we're sitting in. So you encourage participation in, as well as globalization of international law, and improvement of it, and an end to the arms trade, to the weapons dealing, to the pushing of these instruments of death on these regions of the globe that we think of as the dangerous, violent places where none of these weapons are created. They're all shipped in from the places we think of as the civilized, benevolent regions of the world. You develop the tools of nonviolent conflict resolution, of nonviolent resistance, of nonviolent peace forces. I love this phrase I just heard of alternative recruitment. And you do the cultural change needed. You create a culture where you can't have a presidential primary debate on CNN where somebody asks, would you be willing to kill hundreds and thousands of innocent children as part of your presidential responsibilities, without somebody somewhere being offended by that. You change the education, you change the entertainment. How many movies have you seen of the distant future with people fighting with weapons of war? This is not impossible because you can't do time travel. This is impossible because you can't continue war for additional decades and centuries and still have the human species. And to convince people through this endless entertainment that you can is just inexcusable. How many movies have you seen of the distant future with war gone and sustainable environmental practices, with not just the military as the top destroyer of the environment, but all destruction of the environment gone, so that you could actually believe humanity still was around? Very few. I can't think of any. You change the holidays. We got more war holidays than Catholic saints' days in this country. You change the monuments, the memorials. They're putting up monuments in this town, wars that have not ended, and there's no end in sight, as well as every past war. I finally saw the first peace monument I've seen in this town today, and it was a giant smokestack that said, "Make rum, not war." Wouldn't have been my first choice, but I was very glad to see it. And when you replace war with these things, you also replace this lifestyle of escalating suicide in the general population, not just as the top killer of members of the military, and shortening of lifespan, with the sort of lengthened lifespan and greater happiness and greater prosperity and greater education and greater health that you have in other wealthy countries. The United States is in fact not number one in anything good or respectable. It is in fact at the bottom of wealthy nations in every measure of quality of life. You replace that. And you do it by stages. You do it by scaling back and converting by stages and sparking a reverse arms race. And then you take on the actual dangers, the things we ought to be scared of. Not the evil Russians and Iranians and North Koreans, but climate change and environmental destruction and nuclear apocalypse and the counterproductive institution of war and all the environmental poisons and guns and unsafe workplaces and bad food and lack of health care. And so I read a speech that Senator Elizabeth Warren gave today and published a version of today. And I don't pick on Elizabeth Warren because she's a woman. I acknowledge up front that most U.S. senators are men, and most of them are even worse. But advocacy for peace that promotes the institution of war is not going to save us. And when you argue that we shouldn't fund the weapons that don't work, that don't kill enough people fast enough, you're not arguing for a step toward peace. When you argue that we should end wars that leave us ill-prepared for other wars, you're not taking on the institution of war. When you declare that these wars have killed some 6,000 human beings in Iraq, a war that in recent years in Iraq has killed well over 1 million human beings, you're not advancing the understanding that will get us out of this mentality that allows the reckless slaughter of people as if they're worthless. When you say, bring the troops home from Afghanistan starting now, does starting now make that a stronger statement or a weaker one? Because they've been starting to bring the damn troops home from Afghanistan for many years now. How about finishing now? Right? How about a concrete commitment to anything? To a reduced military budget by a certain amount? To pick a war and end it, any war? How about pick a weapons system? How about pick a treaty you'd join? These speeches give us rhetoric, and sometimes it's better than you'd hope, but it's never concrete commitments to anything, the way it is on other issues. Nothing whatsoever about a better system, as Samantha and Kendall described. Nothing on international law. So when you look at where we are, look at what happened in the Senate yesterday. Do I still have minutes here?
I'll give you 2 more minutes.
Look at what, for the first time in the history of the United States Senate, they took a vote in favor of a step toward the Congress ending a war. And you know, this was a discharge, then you got cloture, then you got amendments, which may be absolutely horrible, then you got final passage, then you got the House of Representatives, then you got the threatened veto, then you got noncompliance, which is what you get from people who've been granted immunity from impeachment. All of this understood, and the giant loophole, you can go on killing anybody you want as long as you say it's Al-Qaeda, which they will do even though they're actually partnered with Al-Qaeda in Yemen. So all of these weaknesses, but there's a reason why the president promised to veto a bill to end the U.S. participation in the war on Yemen. There's a reason why they sent Mattis and Pompeo over to the U.S. Senate yesterday to beg and plead, even though they had nothing to offer, even according to the Republican chair of the committee who's been the problem. Because this is a precedent nobody wants. None of the weapons dealers, nobody in the White House wants the Congress beginning to do its job after 2 centuries and decide on a war or not. this is a scary thing for them. And so this is to be encouraged. And the fact that we went from 55 people in the U.S. Senate in March voting to continue genocide against the people of Yemen to 37, that's progress. I mean, it's progress over a very low bar, but mathematically, that is progress, and it has to be built on and encouraged. And if that's possible, if you can pick one of the U.S. wars, which probably nobody in this room can even name all of the current major U.S. wars, which is a problem even the Romans never had. If you can end one of them, this goes to the possibility of going somewhere. You can end two of them. And if you can end two of them, you can end three of them. And you could not start new ones, right? So, and you could get to the point that we're going to be celebrating the 70th anniversary on Monday of a nation called Costa Rica putting its military in exactly the place it belonged, in a museum, where it has been from that day to this for 70 years. We can move by stages to that position. Thank you very much for including me. I'm going to pass around a sheet with a declaration of peace from World Beyond War that has now been signed in more countries than the U.S. military has its troops in. And if you're inclined to sign it, we'd appreciate that.
So there's no way to summarize what's just been said here. I'll leave it up to you, but to me there's something powerful and a narrative that I see as emerged. We start with this vision from Samantha of an ideal, to Kendall, bringing us to a sense of promise that can be nurtured by making this shift of consciousness, this global citizenship, to the hope that comes from individual responsibility that I think Annalisa so carefully outlined, to the questions that are posed by Madison about how we disrupt these narratives. And we have to have a conversation about that, because that's what peace studies is all about, disrupting those narratives. So we'll talk about that later. To embracing the political reality that David has so keenly outlined. So a lot for us to digest. I want to turn it to you. Before we jump into a Q&A, I want to have an opportunity for you to just do a quick little bit of connection and reflection. So maybe in all that you've just heard, what might be one thing that gives you hope for the promise of a changing system from what you've heard today, and why? And then the second question, you don't have to answer these all completely, but the second question is, what maybe do you feel you hadn't heard today that you still think needs to be discussed if we're going to make the shift a reality? And so just turn to your immediate neighbor really quickly and just have 2 or 3 minutes to discuss that. And then whatever questions come up, whatever questions you had before, we'll bring back to our panel. And I invite our friends joining us on Facebook to type in some little questions and messages for us as well, and we'll see if we can answer those, okay? So take a moment to turn to your neighbor. Question?
Somebody mentioned restorative justice, and I understand that concept, particularly as it's applied to conflicts between individuals. But I would like to see some concrete examples of where restorative justice has actually been effectively used at a nation level or at a global level.
I need a minute to think about that.
All right, let's take another question and we'll let her think about it. Another question? Yes, please.
I look at the whole notion of, dominance in terms of the world order as a major shift from, countries wishing to become more powerful than the other. And this really drives nations to show more military muscles in terms of acquiring weapons, or even raising the resources to do so. I know there are lots of good intention, especially from peace activists like us, but with the wherewithal that is lesser in terms of what peace activists can gain and deliver as against most of the speakers have mentioned, the plethora of resources put in terms of weaponizing and that kind of thing. So that shift of balance of power from the top to the ordinary people can really leverage the playing field. But with the economic interest in those who have the means to produce more weapons, and with governments leveling taxes on people, and then paying the military with the taxpayers' money, really counteracts the good intention from peace activists. So how, in terms of the power states and their quest for power, America wants to maintain it. Russia is building new ammunitions, and North Korea is coming up with a new theory of weapons of mass destruction. So with this kind of thing, I think there should be a way that the ordinary citizens from different countries can pressure government so there is a shift of power. So how do we leverage the potentials of peace activists and elevate them to ensure that we can meet these goals?
Big question. All right, so I see people scribbling lots of good notes for that. And maybe one more question we can take? Yes, in the back.
Hi. I saw on your original diagram up there a mention of peace journalism. And I was interested to hear what you guys have discussed around journalism, communication, and weaponization of information generally.
Fantastic. And do we have any questions from Facebook? Nothing significant that we will answer at this time. Okay, great. So popcorn style, if anyone has something they'd like to respond to in a burning way first.
Well, to the first question about restorative justice at a national level, or taking it and expanding on it so that it can be applicable beyond interpersonal, there are a few examples. I would offer Rwanda and the use of gacaca, which was a restorative justice system that emerged from Rwandan historical Rwandan tribes used it before colonialism as a form of restorative justice, and after the genocide, they nationally returned to the gacaca system as an institution which they were able to process crimes and also promote healing. So I think that that's one pretty prominent example that we can learn a lot from.
This is one of the kind of inspiring things that came up in our conversations that I had not ever really considered at the scale of the global system employing the notions of restorative justice. So this is an inspiration that I'm taking from this course. And I don't know if we have a model at that scale yet, but certainly we can see the value in shifting. International law is focused on a form of retributive justice to something that's restorative. If we invest the capital in thinking about it, there is nothing there that I'm aware of, Matt.
Something along the lines of reparations might become a vehicle for this. If that was the expectation before the war, that there are going to be reparation expectations enforceable through a global enforcement mechanism, one could imagine that this would discourage some kinds of actions.
Right. It's possible.
I think it's, we're going to have to get to an international criminal court for non-Africans, right, that doesn't just prosecute Africans and that isn't under the thumb of the permanent members of the Security Council, so-called. But I think you can go back and see some limited and flawed examples very prominently of something in the right direction. If you compare the Marshall Plan to the ending of the First World War, it certainly was far superior, if quite flawed, and certainly points in a far better direction than the way in which the First World War was ended, that had quite wise people predicting World War II on the spot. That was not restorative justice in any way, shape, or form.
So to pivot a little bit, one thing I just wanted to follow up on that I thought was particularly powerful that the students in the spoke to is this idea that the current system and the predisposition to conflict isn't inevitable. These systems have very much been constructed by human beings and can be disrupted. The nation state itself is not actually that old as a system that dominates and dictates how the international system functions. And just thinking kind of to your question of how do we elevate these questions and peace activists, I think this dialogue is extraordinarily important. So changing how you think and in your conversations, rather than treating, as David said very eloquently, that this is the way it has to be in the future is just not correct. That we actually have the tools to challenge, and if not radically, in our everyday life, the assumptions that this is necessarily our trajectory.
I think building on that, one thing I was thinking of as an example, I know that ICANN, the Coalition to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, uses this, what they call the dilemma of opposition is the intention. So when you get enough countries to sign on to this treaty and to say that the system that you have is wrong and that this doesn't mean that you're powerful because you have a nuclear weapon, then maybe you can just shift the narrative of what this power means and what a strong state looks like, and the people within the state, especially in the United States, it gives me some hope that if you can motivate citizens in the United States to believe that nuclear weapons are wrong, then the government faces this dilemma of opposition where their citizens are against it. Can they continue perpetuating, despite the economic incentives, if the people are against it, can they be elected if they're going to perpetuate the system? So I think that's an interesting idea.
Sam, do you have anything else you want to respond to?
No, I mean, I think that's the most important point. At the end of the day, that governments exist to represent people, and so individual civilian actions matter.
David, do you have one last thought?
Well, there were some other questions I think we haven't touched on as much as the first one, and I would say that, that the United States is the top supplier of weapons to dictatorships, to poor countries, to so-called democracies, to the world. And there are a number of nations that have now stopped selling weapons to Saudi Arabia for moral and public pressure type reasons, and the United States could do the same. But this notion that you shouldn't sell bombs to countries that abuse human rights is just grotesquely absurd on its face, because no one has yet explained how you use bombs in a manner that doesn't violate human rights. There is, in fact, the right not to be bombed, just as there is the right not to be killed with whatever the type of saw, bone saw, or whatever. So I think if getting upset about a single murder can get senators to act against hundreds of thousands of murders, I'm all for it. But at some point, we have to recognize that there isn't such a thing as giving instruments of mass murder to institutions that are going to use them in a way that does respect human rights. Doesn't exist. I also think it's important to note, given the comments we heard, that Russia is reducing its military spending, not increasing it, and that the United States could follow suit. And if the United States Congress would just put in a requirement that the United States cannot spend any more than 4 times the next nearest spender on militarism, you would see the manipulation by other countries of the United States down to a peaceful society. That would be all that would be required. And I think, that maybe the most important thing I'd like to see in terms of peaceful journalism is journalists willing to stop parroting lies that have been repeated too many times. So when one of the best journalists I know of, Amy Goodman, yesterday says, Russia seized and illegally annexed Crimea, you know that somebody wrote that for her who understands it to be the truth because they heard it 10,000 times. But what better way is there for people to self-determine their fate than to vote, and vote 90% or more, and not a single person critiquing that as a threat to global peace is willing to propose that they re-vote, because everybody knows they're going to vote the same way again. So I think we have to be willing to hear things 10,000 times and still understand them to be blatantly false and even self-contradictory, and to stop talking that way. It's to question every word and every phrase and every use of language, and the use of the first person plural pronoun, and the use of words like security, and talk honestly, regardless of how everybody else talks.
Also, just to speak a little bit about peace journalism, one thing that we've spoken about in class has been the idea that we frame a lot of our written work based on war. So even if you think back to like your history classes in high school, they're often less about holistic history as they are like a linear progression of the wars that this country has been in. And so how do you reframe written media in a way that explores or discusses peace and sort of change the vocabulary to make peace the default and war the outlier, rather than have war be the default?
Yeah, I think that takes me to Dave's last suggestions about the extent of media frenzy and Hollywood about all this culture of violence. And most of the films that come off today, I mean, it's proliferating with new ways that weapons can be tested on movies, and a lot of young people coming up are using games that are very violent, and all this culture of education needs to go even within the entertainment industry. That is one place that needs a progressive peace approach that will allow producers to really rethink the nature of what movies they will show to the world, especially in terms of violence movies. So there will be a more widespread culture of peace, because every day we are beset by movies that are really horrendous, and I think that's really in for all of us. So thanks for that suggestion.
So we are essentially out of time, and I just want to make sure that everyone knows we'll have opportunity if everyone wants to buy a copy of the book that we've been talking about all night long. And David also has some other books here for sale. We'll sell them at a very affordable price tonight to be negotiated at the table. And I just want to thank again David and Madison and Annalisa and Kendall and Samantha for really helping us extend this dialogue in a lot of really important and rich directions. And I hope you found as much inspiration as I found in being with these three amazing students all semester long in just this conversation tonight, and that you'll go out and do the work of challenging the cultural narrative in everything that you do. So thank you very much.